I'm going to make the case of why you should never own a property such as a house, a condo, or an apartment in the United States of America. The only exception would be if you have, say, $20 million cash. Then by all means go ahead and purchase a $2 to $3, maybe $4 million of a house, by all means, because that makes sense. So there's a concept called the 28/36 rule, which is used by JP Morgan Chase and other lenders to calculate mortgage affordabilities. This means that they recommend no more than 28% of your total monthly income go toward housing costs, and your total debt payments, including housing and student loans if you have any, should not exceed 36% of your total gross monthly income. In short, less than 30% of your total income should go toward two necessities, and maybe another 20% on utilities, food, gas, and other essentials. Ideally, you should be able to save at least 50% of your gross income, which for most Americans is not realistic. But that is how much money you have to save and have to be able to spend to be able to afford a house, according to these financial institutions. The number one reason of why I believe you should never own a house in America is, as of October 2025, in almost every realistic scenario, renting for life makes far more sense than owning a house in America. The average 30-year fixed mortgage rate is hovering around 6.3 to 6.4%. To put that into perspective, on a $700K mortgage, your principal plus interest alone would be about $4,351 per month, and that does not include property tax, insurance, maintenance, HOA fees, etc. Meanwhile, studies show that in all 50 of the largest US metro areas, renting is currently all cheaper than buying, especially when you factor in those hidden home ownership costs. Although the income gap is keep widening. To afford a typical home, Americans now need to make around 82% more than what they would need to afford a comparable rental. Now, there is a very good argument that can be made for people who really want to own a home, and that is if you are planning to start a family and having children. So naturally, you'd want to live in a nice home in a beautiful neighborhood with access to great schools. That makes sense. And those properties are pretty much the only properties that are still being chased after at this time. A few days ago, I made a video talking about how quiet the American housing market has become lately. And it's true, the only properties that are still moving, whether they're being sold or rented out, are the ones located near top-rated high schools. Everything else are just sitting there for months and months. I personally have some personal experience about this. I have visited quite a few rental properties lately, places that I was genuinely interested in. And at first, most landlords didn't seem that interested in me because I am relatively young and was looking to rent an entire house all by myself. But just a few days later, they all started messaging me like I was a fresh piece of meat and they were the dogs chasing after it. I have also been getting a bunch of notifications from the app Zillow lately. A lot of these same properties I have checked out before, the ones that have just been sitting there basically vegetating, started cutting their asking prices. Some by as little as $100 a month, others by as much as $500 a month. Yet still, most of them are not being touched. The only houses that are being rented out are the ones in really good school districts. But even those, in a few years of time, are going to be harder and harder to be rented out because young people today are not dating, are not getting married, are not starting families, and aren't having sex, so aren't having babies. And this brings me to the second point of why I believe, actually, let me take the word believe back, why I know the American housing market is going to stay depressed for a very long time. Because the birth rate keeps dropping, so people are not buying houses. People are not purchasing properties. We are literally seeing this being played out right now in China and South Korea, and is exactly what happened with Japan in the late 1990s during their housing and asset bubble crisis. To put it simply, it is a known phenomenon. When inflation gets unreasonably high, when the housing prices become unimaginably expensive, people stop having sex, and that will eventually trigger a very long, slow housing market depression. And according to Japan, it can last as long as 30 years. In fact, it's completely normal in Japan today for people to rent a home and raise their entire family in a rental property for their entire lives. And I do expect to see the same thing happen in America, not overnight, but gradually for the next 20, 30, maybe even 50 years to come. Immigrants are typically the most willing group to have a lot of babies to start a traditional family, and yet they are the ones being blocked out of America right now, largely thanks to Trump administration's chaotic policies. Now, to be fair, I think the Trump administration, Trump himself, did get one thing right about this whole broken immigration system. Of how to fix it is the introduction of the gold card. It's not a full reality yet, but in theory, it could let some rich people obtain green cards much faster than the broken system before. But beyond that, the current immigration environment in the US is a little away from welcoming. In fact, in almost every way possible, it's actively discouraging immigrants, international professionals, and international students, even just travelers, from coming into America, which we all know is a massive portion to the American economy. So of course, cities like Las Vegas are in a crisis now. So naturally, in the next few years, we should not expect immigrants to be a major force in the housing market either, because they are not even coming in. And the ones who are still coming in are not exactly having the easiest time of staying in, so of course they have no reason to purchase a house because they don't know if they can stay or not. The last argument I'm going to make is this. Historically speaking, you'd be much better off having your money invested in the American stock market and the American bond market than having it in the American housing market. If you had $1 million 20 years ago and you have invested that into major American companies versus buying a house in one of the hottest areas in America, such as New York City or the Bay Area, California, your return from the stock market or the bond market would have been way higher. For instance, over the last 20 years, the S&P 500 has returned around 7 to 8% a year on average, while US home prices have grown only about 4 to 5% a year. So if you had put $1 million into the S&P 500 20 years ago, it would be worth roughly $4.3 million today, and that's not even counting the dividends. Meanwhile, the same $1 million home in San Francisco or New York City would be worth somewhere around $2 to $2.5 million, depending on the exact area. Now, this is not me telling you to throw all of your money into the stock market. If anything, I think the stock market and the bond market is really volatile right now, so I'd be very careful with that. What I am trying to say is, historically speaking, the housing market just hasn't performed as well as the stock market or the bond market. And looking ahead, my expectations for the real estate business over the next 10, 20, even 30 years aren't nearly as strong as they are for the stock or the bond market. Because by the end of the day, the stock market represents money. It reflects productivity, innovation, and actual business growth. But a house, on the other hand, is where you live, a place for shelter, for comfort, and having a family. It should never be this stressful. It should be affordable, and historically speaking, whenever the housing market becomes too stressful and extremely unaffordable, it's usually the breaking point of things. Hence Japan in the early 1990s. Today, Tokyo's housing market is actually one of the most affordable among all major global mega cities, but it took 30 years to get there. So before the same cycle plays out in America, my earnest advice is the following. Think very carefully before deciding to buy a house in today's America. Ask yourself, do you really need one, or do you just want to have one because that's what your parents and your grandparents did or told you to do? Just like how they told you to learn how to code 20 years ago, which made sense back then, but today, My name is Lee. Please do not buy a house in 2025 or 2026 unless you have $20 million.